Symbol 200BTHE public thought they knew Robin Gibb by the haunting tremor in his voice, the dazzling heights of global superstardom, and the timeless hits that define generations of music lovers. Yet, away from the flashing stage lights and the roaring crowds, there existed a deeply private world that completely defied conventional societal standards. It was a life lived on the margins of traditional morality, anchored by a marriage that baffled even their closest friends and confidants. For decades, rumors and whispered secrets swirled around his household, painting a picture of domestic chaos, betrayal, and hidden relationships. Now, as the full scope of their arrangement comes to light through personal reflections, the narrative shifting around the iconic musician is less about a broken home and more about an intentional, deeply deliberate lifestyle choice. Symbol 200BWHEN analyzing the union between Robin and DWINAGIBB, one must first abandon the traditional vocabulary of romance, because words like broken or unfaithful simply do not apply to their unique vocabulary. They did not view their marriage as a fragile glass vase that shattered the moment an outside attraction developed, but rather as an evolving, flexible agreement. From the very beginning, long before the massive wealth, the headline scandals, and the media scrutiny took over their lives, they made a conscious choice to reject normalcy. They met in the vibrant cultural landscape of London when Robin was already balancing the suffocating weight of global fame, while DWINA was carving out her own identity as an independent artist and writer. Symbol 200BWHAT truly brought them together was not a mutual desire for a quiet, predictable white picket fence existence, but a shared philosophical conviction that human relationships should not be bound by rigid societal constraints. Early in their courtship, they reached an explicit understanding that would later scandalize the public and intrigue cultural commentators for years to come. They mutually decided that their marital bond would never be built on the foundation of sexual exclusivity or romantic jealousy. Robin openly confessed in media interviews that he felt absolutely zero threat from the concept of his wife exploring connections with other people, a radical sentiment that DWINA enthusiastically mirrored in her own public statements. Symbol 200BTO this highly unconventional couple, jealousy was never viewed as a natural proof of deep romantic love, but rather as a toxic limitation on personal growth and creative freedom. They firmly believed that their internal connection, which they described as an intense emotional, intellectual, and spiritual alignment, was powerful enough to withstand any outside physical encounter. This concept sounded incredibly abstract and theoretical during the early days of their marriage, almost like a philosophical exercise discussed by bohemian artists in candlelit rooms. However, over time, this exact open framework became the literal bedrock upon which they constructed their entire daily lives and long-term future together. Symbol 200BDWINA would later elaborate on this dynamic by explaining that highly creative individuals possess an inherent need to live outside the standard boundaries that govern ordinary society. She always described their marital dynamic as a state of absolute personal freedom, though she was very careful to emphasize that freedom did not mean emotional detachment. They were not two passing ships drifting aimlessly in the night or leading entirely separate, cold existences under one roof. On the contrary, they remained intensely intertwined in profound ways that completely bypassed the usual definitions of traditional marriage, creating an insular world that belonged solely to them. Symbol 200BTHEIR profound connection was reinforced by an array of striking personal coincidences, including the remarkable fact that they shared the exact same calendar birthday, which they viewed as a cosmic sign. Beyond that, they shared a deep, lifelong fascination with ancient history, esoteric mythology, and supernatural phenomena, which constantly fueled their late-night intellectual debates. DWINA eventually immersed herself completely in the study of Druidism and alternative spiritual paths, earning a highly respected status within those mystical communities over the years. Meanwhile, Robin remained utterly consumed by the demanding world of music, spending endless hours isolated in his studio writing, composing, and arranging complex vocal harmonies. Symbol 200BCRUCIALLY, this open arrangement was never a dirty secret hidden away in dark closets or managed through elaborate webs of lies and deception. DWINA openly and matter-of-factly acknowledged that her husband engaged in various physical flings, sometimes even involving individuals who moved within their immediate social and artistic circles. These brief romantic encounters were not shocking scandals uncovered by invasive tabloid journalists years after the fact. They were everyday realities that were understood from the start. For a remarkably long period of time, this complex domestic machinery functioned smoothly without causing a public collapse or a bitter divorce. Symbol 200B from an outsider's perspective, it was incredibly easy to dismiss their entire marriage as a chaotic, dysfunctional mess or a symptom of rock star indulgence. Inside the walls of their home, however, the relationship was meticulously structured around a hidden set of rules that both partners fully comprehended. What makes their biography so endlessly fascinating is not just the mere existence of this open arrangement, but the specific moment it was tested by the unpredictable chaos of real life. Open relationships can easily thrive when they exist purely as abstract philosophies or fleeting physical encounters, but those invisible boundaries quickly become real when unexpected consequences emerge. Symbol 200B FOR Robin and DWINA. The ultimate test of their philosophical experiment did not arrive in the form of a secret betrayal or a sudden dramatic outburst of jealousy. Instead, it arrived in the most permanent, life-altering form possible: the unexpected conception and impending arrival of a brand new human life. This monumental development did not just mildly challenge their bohemian philosophy, it utterly exposed the natural human limits of it. It instantly forced both of them to confront the massive, painful gulf between what an artistic mind can accept in theory and what a human heart can endure in reality. Symbol 200B, as the news of this impending birth began to settle into their consciousness, the carefully constructed equilibrium of their household began to fracture under the weight of real-world gravity. The abstract idea of freedom suddenly had a beating heart, a name, and a permanent claim on their collective future. No amount of spiritual philosophy or artistic rationalization could alter the fact that their private world had been permanently breached by an outside reality. It was a moment of profound truth that forced a complete reevaluation of the unconventional vows they had made decades earlier in the name of love and freedom. Symbol 200BTHE transition from fleeting encounters to a structured, parallel emotional reality marked the true end of their innocence regarding their open marital agreement. It became glaringly obvious that while physical intimacy can be easily compartmentalized, the creation of a family unit cannot be managed through simple philosophical agreements. The delicate tapestry they had spent years weaving was suddenly being pulled by threads they had never intended to introduce into their domestic sanctuary. It sparked a quiet, internal crisis that threatened to dismantle the very core of what they had built together. Symbol 200BTHROUGHOUT. This initial period of realization, the silence within their grand estate grew heavy with unspoken anxieties and a profound sense of shifting foundations. The couple who had once proudly proclaimed their immunity to standard human jealousy found themselves staring into an unpredictable abyss of emotional vulnerability. It was no longer a question of whether they could tolerate a temporary distraction, but whether their core bond could survive a permanent restructuring. The public, completely unaware of the internal storm brewing behind closed doors, continued to view them through the lens of standard celebrity gossip. Symbol 200BYET. Those who understood the deep intellectual synergy between Robin and DWINA knew that their response to this crisis would never follow a predictable Hollywood script. They did not immediately rush to divorce courts or engage in public slinging matches through the media tabloids. Instead, they retreated inward, attempting to apply their lifelong belief system to a situation that seemed explicitly designed to shatter it completely. It was a desperate, fascinating attempt to maintain control over a narrative that was quickly spinning out of their hands and into the public domain. The strength of their shared history, built on decades of mutual creative respect and shared spiritual pursuits, acted as a temporary shield against immediate collapse. They clung to the idea that because they had written their own rules at the beginning, they could somehow write a new chapter to accommodate this massive disruption. However, the sheer emotional weight of what was transpiring began to take a visible toll on their daily interactions and their artistic output. The music Robin produced during this turbulent era carried a distinct, underlying tension that mirrored the unspoken conflicts of his private life. Dwina, meanwhile, found solace in her spiritual practices, attempting to find a higher cosmic meaning in a situation that felt intensely earthly and grounded in human frailty. She refused to play the traditional role of the scorned, victimized wife, maintaining a fiercely dignified exterior even as the foundation of her home trembled. This absolute refusal to conform to societal expectations of victimhood confused both the media and their personal acquaintances, who eagerly anticipated a dramatic, explosive separation. As the weeks turned into months, the realization set in that their marriage had entered an entirely new epoch from which there was absolutely no turning back. The boundaries that had once been fluid and invisible were now being drawn in sharp, unmistakable lines that demanded total clarity from both partners. It was a period of intense, quiet negotiation, not through lawyers and legal documents, but through long, exhausting conversations in the dead of night. They were trying to redefine the exact meaning of their commitment in the face of an entirely unprecedented emotional landscape. This era of their lives serves as a powerful testament to the sheer complexity of human relationships when they are stripped of standard societal safety nets. By choosing to live without the guardrails of conventional marriage, they had fully exposed themselves to unique psychological challenges that few couples ever have to face. The absolute freedom they had cherished for so long had suddenly transformed into a heavy burden of responsibility that required immense emotional stamina to carry. It was a stark reminder that even the most radical philosophies must eventually pay a toll to the realities of human nature. Despite the growing pressure, the underlying love and intellectual admiration they possessed for one another never completely evaporated into resentment or hatred. They remained fiercely protective of each other's vulnerabilities, even as they struggled to navigate the collateral damage of their own radical choices. This lingering, deep-seated loyalty was the secret engine that kept their relationship moving forward through the dense fog of uncertainty and mutual pain. It proved that their original bond was indeed built on something far deeper than mere physical exclusivity or superficial social compliance. As the ultimate climax of this internal drama approached, the world watched with bated breath, sensing that a major shift was occurring within the legendary singer's inner sanctum. The stories leaking to the press were conflicted, filled with half-truths and sensationalized exaggerations that failed to capture the true philosophical nature of the struggle. It was a narrative that could not be properly understood through a simple tabloid headline, because it involved the slow, painful evolution of an entirely unique human contract. Ultimately, the first chapter of their grand marital experiment concluded not with a definitive ending, but with a profound, lingering question mark about the true limits of freedom. They had successfully proven that a marriage could survive outside the box of tradition for decades, but they were about to discover what happens when the box is completely destroyed. The stage was finally set for an intense, highly publicized confrontation with reality that would forever alter the legacy of Robin Gibb and the woman who chose to stand by his side through it all. Part 2. The carefully managed space that had defined their marriage for years finally collapsed when the abstract philosophy of their union met a concrete reality. For a very long time, the unspoken boundaries of their relationship had held firm because they existed within an elite, protected bubble of wealth and artistic eccentricity. What made their situation genuinely workable on a day-to-day basis was the comforting illusion that everything remained within strict, manageable limits. That fragile domestic balance experienced a massive, irreversible shift when a quiet involvement inside their own household transformed into something far too significant to ignore. Claire Yang was never a distant, fleeting figure passing briefly through Robin's incredibly busy life as a touring global rock star. She was an intimate, permanent fixture of their daily domestic environment, working directly within the household and managing their private spaces. Her constant, everyday presence stretched across their grand estate in Oxfordshire all the way to their luxurious, sunny residence in Miami, Florida. This intense, unavoidable proximity fundamentally altered the entire nature of her connection with Robin from the very moment she stepped through their front door. What might have easily been dismissed in the past as just another temporary fling slowly and quietly blossomed into something incredibly stable, consistent, and emotionally heavy. Over the course of several years, what had started as a strictly private, hidden involvement became deeply embedded in the very architecture of their domestic lives. This ongoing situation completely blurred the lines between what was considered a harmless personal distraction and what was acceptable within their unique marriage. According to detailed accounts that eventually leaked to the press, this profound relationship had been actively ongoing since the early years of the 2000s. This extensive duration introduced a massive, critical difference that their previous marital agreements had never truly anticipated or prepared for. Unlike the brief, superficial encounters that Dwina had previously tolerated with an open mind, this situation carried immense emotional weight and structural continuity. It was no longer a peripheral event existing harmlessly on the distant margins of their marriage. It had become deeply intertwined with their daily existence. The longer this parallel relationship continued, the more impossible it became to contain within the original open-minded framework they had so proudly constructed. Initially, reports suggested that Dwina was fully aware of the growing closeness between her husband and the live-in housekeeper, but chose not to intervene. Her deeply ingrained belief in personal freedom and her rejection of standard marital jealousy heavily dictated her relaxed initial response. She had spent a lifetime publicly proclaiming that creative minds should never be chained down by the boring, restrictive rules of conventional middle-class morality. From her philosophical perspective, the only thing that truly mattered was the deep, transcendent spiritual connection she shared exclusively with Robin. For a considerable period of time, this elevated mindset allowed her to gracefully tolerate the unfolding situation without engaging in bitter screaming matches or domestic ultimatums. This stoic lack of confrontation temporarily reinforced the comforting idea that their radical marriage could survive absolutely anything on its own terms. However, the comfortable abstract theories they loved to discuss quickly began to evaporate as the physical reality of the situation rapidly evolved. The ultimate, explosive turning point arrived when Claire Yang officially discovered that she was pregnant with the legendary singer's child. That single biological fact changed absolutely everything in a dramatic fashion that could never be ignored, rationalized, and explained away by spiritual philosophy. What had previously existed as a private, quiet understanding between consenting adults suddenly transformed into something permanent, visible, and legally binding. The subsequent birth of Robin's youngest daughter, Snow, introduced a massive new dimension that extended far beyond bohemian lifestyles and entered the realm of legal responsibility. Those closest to the chaotic situation described Dwina's immediate emotional reaction as incredibly intense, shocking, and profoundly transformative for the entire household. Her sudden anger did not stem from the discovery of the physical intimacy itself, but from the realization that the fundamental rules of engagement had changed. The arrival of an innocent child meant that a situation once contained within an open arrangement had officially crossed a dangerous line into permanent family restructuring. It was no longer a simple matter of personal adult choices. It was now about a brand new life that would forever reshape their legacy. This monumental event forced an immediate, painful confrontation with personal limits that they had never clearly articulated or tested before. In a sharp, decisive break from her usual philosophy of absolute tolerance, Dwina reportedly demanded that Claire immediately pack her bags and leave their estate. This stark eviction marked a massive psychological shift from intellectual acceptance to outright emotional rejection within the grand Oxfordshire mansion. The absolute sense of control and sophistication that had once proudly defined their marriage was instantly replaced by bitter domestic tension and deep psychological conflict. What they had once happily labeled as beautiful freedom now felt like a dangerous, reckless experiment that had gone entirely too far. Yet even as the public scrutiny reached a fever pitch and tabloid journalists camped outside their gates, the core of their marriage refused to implode. Despite the immense public embarrassment, the private anger, and the heavy emotional strain, Dwina made the shocking decision not to walk away from her husband. What followed in the wake of this domestic explosion revealed the true, baffling complexity of the unique bond they shared. Even after enduring a crisis that would have instantly destroyed any standard marriage, their mutual connections somehow managed to endure. This survival left outside observers, family members, and the global media completely bewildered, questioning what mysterious force held them together through such deep betrayal. Dwina did not attempt to rewrite their history or pretend that the heartbreaking situation with Claire and baby Snow was not happening. Instead, she chose to process and explain the ongoing crisis in a way that revealed a completely different, highly resilient definition of marital commitment. In subsequent interviews, she spoke with an eerie, calm dignity about the idea that her marriage was never anchored by physical exclusivity. She continuously insisted that their union was grounded in an unbreakable, lifelong dedication rather than a desire for strict control over one another's bodies. She maintained that no matter what chaotic events occurred around them, they possessed an absolute, unspoken certainty that they would die together. This controversial worldview was not presented to the public as a desperate defense mechanism, but as a genuine reflection of how she viewed the universe. For her, the presence of outside relationships and parallel families did not automatically erase the sacred core connection she shared with Robin. This incredibly unique perspective became even more fascinating when complex details regarding the legal and financial aftermath began to circulate within the music industry. Following Robin's tragic diagnosis with terminal illness, intense rumors began to surface regarding massive friction over future funeral arrangements and estate inheritances. Speculation ran rampant that Claire Yang and her young daughter Snow were being systematically frozen out of the family's public mourning rituals. Simultaneously, Dwina fiercely pushed back against the media narrative that painted her as a vengeful, greedy wife driven by deep-seated jealousy. She continuously emphasized to anyone who would listen that she had never allowed jealousy to dictate her moral actions or financial decisions. She made it a point of absolute honor to clarify that both Claire and young Snow had been fully and generously provided for financially. The staggering financial arrangements themselves perfectly mirrored the profound, overlapping complexity of Robin Gibb's dual emotional and physical existence. His massive estate, valued in the tens of millions of dollars due to decades of hit songwriting royalties, was left almost entirely to Dwina. This legal decision powerfully reinforced her undisputed status as the absolute anchor and central figure of his complicated life. At the exact same time, substantial legal provisions were carefully executed to ensure that Claire and Snow received permanent long-term financial security. This unique dual financial structure beautifully illustrated the emotional reality of his life, which refused to be divided cleanly into separate, neat boxes. His relationships overlapped in a messy, human way that completely defied simple moral categorization or standard legal templates. What makes this specific era of their long journey so deeply compelling is the unwavering affection Dwina used when describing her late husband. Even when openly discussing the most painful and controversial aspects of his domestic behavior, her voice remained filled with genuine warmth and admiration. She chose to focus her mind on their decades of shared experiences, their profound late-night conversations, and their immense intellectual synergy. She utterly refused to present herself to the world as a long-suffering victim who had miserably endured a toxic, unfaithful marriage. Instead, she proudly framed herself as a powerful woman who had fully, consciously chosen her unique lifestyle, even when the practical consequences became unbearable. At the same time, an undeniable undercurrent of human sorrow remained visible beneath her fiercely dignified philosophical exterior. The painful distinction between intellectually accepting a radical lifestyle theory and actually living through its messy real-world consequences was always present. Their lifelong motto of live and let live had successfully guided them through youth, but the reality of a secret child introduced permanent scars. Ultimately, what remained completely undeniable to the public was the sheer, stubborn durability of the profound bond they had forged. It stubbornly refused to collapse under the immense weight of global media judgment, familial disapproval, or internal heartbreak. It did not transform into a bitter, cold war of resentment, nor did it dissolve into an ugly public legal battle over millions of dollars. Instead, it continued to exist in a mysterious, highly complex space that beautifully blended absolute loyalty with profound human contradiction. Part 3. When Robin Gibb finally closed his eyes for the last time after a grueling, highly publicized battle with cancer, the unique structure vanished. The grand philosophical framework that had successfully sustained their unconventional marriage for decades disappeared instantly, leaving Dwina in a state of profound isolation. What remained in the wake of his tragic passing was not the sensationalized tabloid story that the public had eagerly followed for years. Instead, it was a quiet, painfully heavy reality that she was forced to navigate completely alone within their massive, empty country home. Inside the quiet walls of their historic Oxfordshire estate, Dwina made a striking emotional decision that deeply surprised many of her closest friends. She consciously chose to leave absolutely everything in the mansion completely untouched, refusing to alter the physical environment he had loved so much. His personal photographs remained exactly where he had placed them. His favorite rooms stayed filled with his lingering presence, and every everyday object remained static. It was as if by meticulously preserving the physical space, she could somehow freeze time and maintain their profound metaphysical connection forever. For Dwina, this intense preservation was never an act of psychological denial or an inability to accept the harsh reality of death. Rather, it was a deliberate choice for spiritual continuity, an outward extension of the unorthodox belief system they had practiced together. She frequently questioned why modern society feels an aggressive need to immediately erase all physical traces of a lost loved one from a home. She passionately argued that doing so erases the valuable, lingering, energetic imprint of a human life far more than it helps the grieving process. Instead of hiding from her profound grief, she deliberately surrounded herself with his living memory on a daily basis. She spent hours watching old video recordings of his performances, listening to his distinct voice, and fully immersing herself in his past. This was her deeply personal way of holding on to the man she had loved, bypassing the global pop icon to find the husband. She deeply missed the private partner who had shared countless profound conversations with her in the middle of the night when the world was dark. That heavy, sudden midnight silence became one of the absolute most difficult adjustments of her entire life after his passing. She frequently noted to visitors that the long winter evenings were the hardest to endure without his chaotic, creative energy filling the rooms. Robin had always been a man who thrived on constant movement and frantic artistic expression, frequently working straight through the night on melodies. The sudden, total absence of that vibrant creative presence caused the familiar rooms of her home to feel incredibly foreign, cold, and vast. Looking back at his final years, she viewed his frantic, exhausting schedule not as a reckless mistake, but as a beautiful, urgent necessity. Despite his rapidly failing health and the advice of medical professionals, Robin had absolutely refused to step away from his creative passions. He continually pushed his fragile body to perform on stage, record new vocals, and aggressively advocate for artists' rights within the music industry. To Dwina, this stubborn determination was the ultimate reflection of his true essence, a man who measured his life through creation rather than preservation. Amidst this dense fog of deep isolation and mourning, a beautiful, unexpected light arrived to completely reshape her daily domestic routine. The joyful arrival of her young grandson, Maxwell Robin, introduced a vibrant new energy into the estate that had once felt so overwhelmingly dark. She often described the immediate period following Robin's death as a completely black emotional space where even friends could not reach her. However, the innocent, demanding presence of a young child quickly altered that heavy dynamic in a profoundly positive way. The baby did not achieve this by magically replacing the massive, irreplaceable loss of her lifelong soulmate and creative partner. Instead, he did it by fiercely demanding her immediate attention, maternal care, and active emotional engagement in the present moment. This beautiful generational shift did not completely erase her lingering sorrow, but it radically altered how she lived alongside it every single day. Instead of her life being defined exclusively by a tragic absence, it began to include beautiful, quiet moments of daily renewal and joy. The rewarding new role of a grandmother gave her a powerful, grounded reason to actively reconnect with the living world around her. She was able to honor the past while simultaneously nurturing the future within the very walls where history had been made. It was not a magical cure for her broken heart, but it represented a crucial, healthy transition into the next chapter of her life. This quiet evolution proved to the world that their unique family story did not simply end with the singer's tragic death. As the years continued to pass, Dwina found herself naturally stepping into a massive, highly complex role regarding his global artistic legacy. She became the primary gatekeeper of his memory, responsible for deciding exactly how his complicated life story would be communicated to future generations. Before his death, Robin had spent hundreds of hours meticulously recording his deepest thoughts, private memories, and artistic secrets onto microcassette tapes. This created an incredibly rare, deeply intimate personal audio archive that only Dwina would ever be granted full, unrestricted access to explore. Listening to those fragile microcassette tapes in the quiet of his old studio became an intensely emotional, bittersweet experience for her. It allowed her to hear his fragile voice speaking directly to her again in a way that felt comforting and unsettling. She described the painstaking process of cataloging these private recordings as a deeply intimate journey filled with untold anecdotes and historical revelations. For her, this project was never about merely documenting a famous career. It was about fully understanding his soul from his own perspective. At the exact same time, she possessed the immense self-awareness to admit that not every single detail would be shared with the public. Crucial aspects of his highly unconventional lifestyle, particularly those tied to the Claire Yang controversy, remained incredibly sensitive for the surviving family. This protective stance perfectly reflected the lingering, deep-seated tension that had defined their entire unique marriage from the very beginning. On one hand, she possessed a fierce desire to be completely honest about a man who lived a wonderfully complex, contradictory life. On the other hand, her powerful instinct to protect his legacy and preserve the beautiful version of him she loved remained completely paramount. This delicate emotional balance is incredibly difficult to maintain, especially when his wildest controversies are the exact things that modern media craves. Concurrently, major Hollywood discussions have actively continued regarding bringing the epic, multi-decade story of the Bee Gees to theater screens worldwide. Past attempts to develop a definitive biographical film have attracted massive interest from legendary directors and A-list actors across the entertainment industry. For Dwina, being actively involved in these high-level creative meetings means maintaining a powerful level of control over how Robin is represented. She is fiercely dedicated to ensuring that his legacy is never reduced to cheap, sensationalized tabloid headlines or overly simplified Hollywood tropes. What makes this final chapter of her journey so profoundly moving is how it beautifully synthesizes all the wild contradictions of his life. He was a global musical icon who experienced unparalleled professional success alongside intense, deeply painful domestic turmoil and public judgment. He was a man capable of the most profound, lifelong emotional loyalty while simultaneously engaging in relationships that threatened to destroy his home. Through the preservation of the tapes, the telling of the stories, and the daily choices she makes, his complex reality is honored. In the absolute end, the ultimate question is not whether a single, objective truth about their marriage will ever be fully revealed. The true question is how a legendary man's soul will be remembered by the world he left behind so prematurely. Because even as Duina works tirelessly to complete his final narrative, she is ultimately deciding which secrets will live forever and which will stay silent. In that beautiful, haunting sense, Robin Gibb's distinct voice continues to exist loudly, vibrantly, and defiantly in the modern world today. His presence is felt not just in the timeless falsetto harmonies of his music, but in the unfolding narrative of a life lived. It is a story still being actively written, forever shaped by the single person who understood his beautiful, flawed humanity better than anyone else.